Greetings. Father Mark signing on, continuing the course on the history of Catholicism in the United States with the next installment of the 1850s, introducing us to the 13th President, Millard Fillmore. Fillmore was born in the year 1800 in Cayuga, New York. Served in the U.S. House of Representatives from 1833 to 1843 as a Whig. Elected vice president along with Zachary Taylor in the election of 1848. And then when Taylor died in office in 1850, as we covered last time, he followed. It was Fillmore signed the Compromise of 1850, which we'll detail shortly, enforced the Fugitive Slave Law, and in a more positive category of accomplishment, he commissioned Admiral Matthew Perry to Japan in 1853 to promote foreign trade. Tainted historically by the Compromise of 1850 and the enforcement of the Fugitive Slave Law, Fillmore was not nominated by the Whigs in 1852, so his own party dumped him. He tried to revive his political career by joining the Know-Nothings, whom we will also encounter shortly, and running for president for them as a third-party candidate in 1856, but lost. So next, I'm going to cover the California Compromise of 1850, or simply the Compromise of 1850. So this really changed things. One might, well, certainly in retrospect, one might plausibly assert that because of the original sin of our country, the slavery, that something like the Civil War was inevitable. It almost happened in 1820 and was temporarily neutralized by the Missouri Compromise. It almost happened again in 1832 over the nullification crisis over the tariff. And that also was neutralized by a compromise. And here again, 1850. And then throughout the 1850s was not a good time to be alive. It's just one crisis after another, until the Civil War happened at the beginning of the next decade. But what happened in the 1860s will not make sense without understanding what happened in the 1850s. So, and it was multivalent. It affected, this compromise of 1850 affected many different strata of life, many different categories of life, politics, economics, morality, philosophy, public activism, and so we're going to have to keep rewinding again and again back to 1850. Like the whole decade really is filtered through this one act. So it was another compromise, just as the Missouri Compromise and as the nullification issue, 1820, 1832, respectively. This was negotiated by moderate congressmen from the North and South. From the South was Henry Clay, of Kentucky, and for the North, Daniel Webster of Massachusetts. The compromise consisted of 5 bills passed by Congress between September 9th and September 20th, 1850, signed by President Fillmore. This postponed the two issues that kept entwining, the slavery issue, of course, but then also the states' rights issue, which became entwined as they were connected, of course, but so it postponed the conflict for another decade or another 11 years. So the 5 bills were: first, California was admitted as the 31st state of the Union on September 9th, 1850. it was admitted as a free state, all of it a free state, even though extending the Missouri Compromise to the Pacific would leave some of California, actually most of California, on the southern side of the Missouri Compromise line, on the slave side. But nevertheless, the compromise was all of California would be admitted as a free state. Second, New Mexico was elevated to the status of a territory, in the pipeline to become a state, but its status as slave or free was deferred to a later date, even though it also was south of the line. Third, Utah was the same, elevated to the status of a territory, put in the pipeline for statehood, but its status as slave or free was also deferred to a later date, even though most of its territory would be north of the line. Fourth, the slave market in the nation's capital, Washington, D.C., was closed. And fifth, a fugitive slave law was passed, which allowed Southern slave owners to demand federal help in securing the capture and return of slaves who escaped to the North. As is the case with most compromises, there was something in this compromise for everyone to hate. And in retrospect, we can see more clearly than they could at the time that it removed the final allegiance that many voters had to the existing two-party structure. The Whigs, who were the federal, the Federalists, the strong centralist, central government types, and the Democrats of the period, who were the states' rights. The California Compromise, along with the implication of assimilating all the newly conquered territories from Mexico into states, reignited the slavery issue and the states' rights issue, which had largely been dormant since the nullification crisis of 1832. This time, the issues would not go away, and they shaped public policy until the Civil War 11 years later. So if you recall, we began this course with, and if you don't remember, you can just look back to the beginning of this playlist on Catholicism in U.S. history, began with 4 videos on the slavery issue, with all the names, dates, all the moral issues, philosophical issues, political issues, so you can refresh your memory with that. So to catch up to the status of the church at this point in history, 1850, in connection with the slavery issue, brings us to become introduced to a Jesuit brother named Joseph Moberly. One of his jobs was teaching languages at Georgetown College. It was not a university yet, but it's the same Georgetown that later became the university. Here, he enters our story because of his other job, which was managing the Maryland Jesuits' estates, which he did until his death. Brother Joseph, along with much of the ecclesiastical establishment of the time, Catholic and Protestant, found themselves trapped by the conventional and anachronistic reading of the New Testament passages referred to in the course introduction in those first 4 videos. Now, in those I gave a number of them, but here I'll just give one example on each side to refresh your memory about the confusion. So one example, St. Paul, in his letter to the Ephesians, chapter 6, beginning at verses 5 through 8. Quote, "Slaves, be obedient to your human masters with fear and trembling, in sincerity of heart, as to Christ, not only when being watched, as if currying favor, but as slaves of Christ, doing the will of God from the heart, willingly serving the Lord and not human beings, knowing that each will be requited from the Lord for whatever good he does, whether he is slave or free. So that's a jarring statement. I mean, telling a slave to obey your master as you would obey Christ. I mean, that's anyway. So yet the same guy, St. Paul, also wrote to the Galatians, his letter to the Galatians, chapter 3, verses 27 and 28, with these words: "For all of you who were baptized into Christ have clothed yourselves with Christ. There is neither Jew nor Greek. There is neither slave nor free person. There is neither male nor female. For you are all one in Christ Jesus." All right, now that sounds better, right? I mean, that's more the New Testament we know. Okay, so there's an apparent contradiction here. And in order to understand it, the problem is just taking a problem can be, and certainly is in this case, just taking the quotes and putting them side by side without the historical circumstances leads to this jarring juxtaposition. So we have to go deeper. In Paul's historical circumstances, remember, he was living as a person of faith, as a monotheist, in the pagan Roman Empire, in which many practices repugnant to the faith were protected by law. The Galatians 3 passage articulates the Christian ideal, within that ideal, worldly stratification based on ethnicity, gender, social status, citizenship in the empire, all of that is erased by the sacrament of baptism, because the sacrament of baptism is a conduit of grace from the supernatural to the natural order. And once we receive that, then we are configured, we're reconfigured, we're cleansed, and with a mark that is never removed. So it doesn't matter what our earthly status is, because we've been configured to the supernatural in a particular way. And all those who have received baptism have likewise been configured that way. Whereas the Ephesians 6 passage is the real. He's addressing people who still have to get up and go to work and live in the Roman Empire, a pagan Roman Empire. And so that is a caution, a prudential teaching, that persons of faith must live within the circumstances of their time and their place. Specifically, slaves in the empire who disobeyed their masters were subject to heinous torture and often murder too. They'd just be publicly tortured to death as a deterrent to other slaves contemplating disobedience. So St. Paul, advising obedience to slaves who lived in such a world, was merely a survival strategy for those who were oppressed and had no hope. I mean, you can't appeal to the law because slavery was legal. So that Ephesians 6 passage that sounded so jarring, that's a survival strategy. It is not an endorsement of ownership of other human beings. Notice it's addressed slaves, be obedient. So he's addressing slaves. And so say, obey, because you can still live a good life. I mean, you can still get to heaven. Whereas, if you disobey your master, of course you can still go to heaven then, but then you're subject to to this horrifying tortures and unjust execution. So now, in mid-19th century United States, all that contextualization is forgotten. So debates leading up to the Civil War used both of those passages as well as others. They were hurled back and forth on both sides, from both sides, to push their objective, either to maintain slavery or to outlaw slavery in the Republic. So back to the Jesuit Brother Joseph. Brother Joseph believed that he could not oppose slavery as being an absolute evil because of passages like Ephesians 6. Yet his experience managing the Jesuit estates, which were plantations, led him to oppose slavery on practical grounds, that it was not profitable. It wasn't worth it. So that led. He's the one that made notes. Since he was managing the estates, he left notes, and those have survived. Those are collected. They're published, and they're called the Woodstock Letters. And so we can trace that, but we can trace the thinking of the order that led to, right, the gradual elimination of slavery on the Jesuit Maryland estates between 1823 and 1838. So slavery was eliminated on their plantations, but the slaves were not emancipated. They were sold. Among the transactions was one to defray the debt of Georgetown College, which was the nucleus of the now much larger university of the same name. In 1838, the Jesuit, the priest who was the provincial of the Jesuit Maryland province, was a guy named Thomas Mulledy, Mulledy. He lived from 1794 to 1860. He served twice as president of Georgetown. In 1838, he authorized the sale of 272 slaves from the Jesuit estates in Maryland for a sum of $115,000. Now that's in 1838 money. I didn't look up, but I looked at in 2020 money. That would be $2.8 million. He sold them to two plantation owners from Louisiana. One of them was Henry Johnson, who had a long career. He actually was born in Virginia, but he's one of those that came to Louisiana and made his professional life here. He served as a representative, a senator, and a governor of Louisiana. He's also a plantation owner. So his purchased slaves were sent to Chatham Plantation. The other purchaser was Jesse Beatty, Batey. He owned a 2,800-acre plantation in Iberville Parish in Louisiana, along with additional land holdings in Point Coupé. On June 19th, 1838, the Reverend Thomas Mulledy of Georgetown University agreed to sell the 272 slaves to these two guys. Beatty acquired 64 of the slaves. The rest of them went to Johnson. And these slaves consisted of all men, women, and children. They ranged in age from, the oldest was 65 years old. The youngest was 18 months old. Half of the 272 were under the age of 18. Following, now, as we saw, again, you have to go back to those first four videos in the playlist if you want to refresh all your memories about this. But just to catch up to the mid-19th century, ownership of slaves by Catholic institutions in the United States was regrettably not unusual. For example, 1754, Anne Matthews was a member of a colonial Maryland Catholic family. she discerned a vocation to religious life. At the time, Maryland was a colony of England, so the anti-popery laws applied. So she, like the future bishop, John Carroll, had to go to Europe, to some Catholic country in Europe, to pursue ecclesiastical life, at least to get the training for that. And then, like Carroll, they could come back, but to get the training and ordination, or in her case, profession, that had to happen in Europe. So in her case, this brought her to the Discalced Carmelite Convent in Hoogstraten, which is now in Belgium. There, in religion, she was given the name Sister Bernardina Teresa Xavier of St. Joseph, then OCD, the Order of Carmelites Discalced. Eventually, she became prioress of that house. In Europe, going back to feudalism, so seminarians, from from the medieval course, it was the custom that families of means sending their daughters into religious life would provide them with a dowry. It was less than the dowry they would give for marriage, but still it was a material contribution. And in the case of girls going into convents, it would be given to the convent, whereas with the dowry, it was part of for marriage, it was part of that. And the dowry could be either in coin, or in land, or in livestock. After the American Revolution prevailed, and civil rights were restored to Catholics, that the anti-popery laws did not apply once the Constitution was ratified, Sister Bernardina was able to return home, accompanied by 3 other Carmelite sisters in similar circumstances. 2 of them were her nieces that had, that had come over like she did to become nuns. In religion, there were Sister Mary Aloysia and Sister Mary Eleanor. The third companion, so the fourth of the group, was actually born in England. But she had, because of the anti-popery laws, she did the same thing. She, went to the continent for her formation. So she also joined the Carmelites in Belgium. And in religion, she was Sister Claire Joseph Dickinson. Dickinson was her family name. Claire Joseph was her name in religion. Surviving the Atlantic crossing from May 1st to July 2nd, 1790, they established the first Mount Carmel, the first Carmel, as they say, the convent, the first convent in the United States at Port Tobacco, Maryland. In a tragic, painfully ironic, really painfully ironic twist, they were only able to return because the new American Constitution granted full civil rights to Catholics by repealing the anti-popery laws. Yet the practice of families endowing, giving dowries to their daughters entering religious life continued in the United States. Now, in itself, that's morally neutral. But they imitated what they knew from Europe, in which case a dowry could be in coin, but often was not. Often it would be land or would be livestock. Like it depended on what the girl's family, if they were farmers, then they could say, okay, well, we'll give you so much grain for a year. Or if they raised animals, okay, well we'll give you these 20 sheep or these 5 horses or cattle or whatever. Now in the United States, slaves were considered property. So that's how we get this moral, this thing where girls who came from plantation owning families, their dowry might include a few horses or a few cattle, or it might include a few slaves given to the convent. And because of the biblical passages like the Ephesians passage, well, okay, there's nothing. All right, this is okay. And as we saw earlier when we covered the Constitution, in order to get the compromise, so that all the 13 colonies would stay together, particularly, Virginia and Georgia, the southern colonies with slavery. Slavery was protected in the Constitution. So that, plus the biblical passage, led them to the conclude that this was okay. A similar sequence of events led to the same outcome when the Sisters of Charity established their convent and later an academy, a school, at Nazareth, Kentucky, 3 miles north of Bardstown. While Port Tobacco, Maryland, was the site of the first convent of religious women holding slaves in the United States, the same state was also home to the first successful Catholic sisterhood in the world, established by women of African descent. So that's, in American history, you have these extremes, morally, politically, economically. I mean, we just have these extremes in the same state. Okay, so this brings us to meet the Oblate Sisters of Providence, established in the same state, Maryland, but in their case, Baltimore instead of Port Tobacco. So the Oblate Sisters, they were in part the work of a French-born Sulpician priest, plus 4 women who were part of the Caribbean refugee colony, which began arriving in Baltimore in the late 18th century after the successful Haitian slave revolt, which we covered earlier in the course. So the priest was Father James Hector Nicholas Joubert, Joubert, lived from 1777 to 1843. As a Sulpician priest, serving, doing his ministry, he discovered it was difficult for the Haitian refugee children to master their religious studies because they were unable to read. So he heard of 2 devout religious women. Well, they weren't, I shouldn't say that because religious has a specific ecclesial meaning. So I'll say there were 2 devout Catholic women who of Caribbean descent who were already conducting a school for black children in their home in Baltimore, Maryland. One of them was Elizabeth Lange, Lange. Later, she's the foundress of the Oblate Sisters, Mother Mary Lange. She was born in a French-speaking community on the island of Cuba around 1794, where she received an excellent education. The Haitian slave uprising and the years of war against France that followed generated waves of French-speaking refugees, many of whom went to Maryland because it had the largest Catholic population in the new United States. By 1813, Elizabeth relocated to Maryland, and established a school for African American children of the refugees, originally in her home in Fells Point, Maryland, along with her friend, Mary Magdalene Balas, B-A-L-A-S. Later, after the order was established, she became Sister Francis. They operated the school as lay women. I mean, not in a religious order yet, but just as lay women, for a decade before they met Father Joubert. In 1828, they accepted his proposal to start a religious community to educate and care for African American children. Now, it so happened these 2 ladies were not married, so they were free to do that. Soon they were joined by two more ladies, Rosine Beige and Teresa Duchemin. Together they opened St. Francis Academy, a Catholic school for girls, and a convent. So they opened a convent, and the school was in the convent. It was located at number 5, St. Mary's Court in Baltimore, Maryland. Its institutional successor, not the same location, but the institutional successor, remains the oldest continuously functioning school for African American Catholic children in the United States. 1 year later, on July 2nd, 1829, at number 610 George Street in Baltimore, the four ladies took vows as the first religious order for women of African descent in the United States. 5 months later, in December, they moved into a row house at number 48 Richmond Street, which served as the mother house for the next 31 years. Over the ensuing years, the order purchased adjacent buildings to accommodate their growth, as well as to house their multiplying ministries. In 1836, the sisters completed a larger school and chapel. The chapel, their chapel, was the first place created intentionally, and as it happened, given their context, exclusively for the use of African American Catholics, where they could access full sacramental life. In 1843, their chaplain, Father Jobert, died, forcing the sisters to receive the sacraments at the nearby St. Alphonsus Church, under the care of German Redemptorists. And we're going to meet them again later in the course. But one of those Redemptorist priests was Father Thaddeus Anwander. He was Bavarian, so from southern Germany. The sisters then opened a second school, this one for African American boys, plus they opened up a third school, but it was a second school for girls. They also opened up a home for the elderly, and they even offered night classes for adult women, African American women. Now, it wasn't really a separate school, it was just more kind of an impromptu thing, but they did offer it. One of the African American, boys, but later, man, who received confirmation in the sisters' chapel was a guy named William Augustine Williams, William A. Williams. Born in 1836 to a slave on George Washington's Mount Vernon plantation, Williams was brought up Baptist. The ministry of the Oblate Sisters of Providence put him into contact with their chaplain, Father Thaddeus Anwander, the Redemptorist. Father Thaddeus encouraged William's interest in scholarship and languages and religion, leading to William's conversion to Catholicism and his confirmation in 1852 in their chapel, in the sisters' chapel, the Oblate Sisters' Chapel. Father Anwander then encouraged a priestly vocation, because Williams was not married. But no seminary in the United States at the time would take him, because he was African American. So where does he go? That means yet another has to go to Europe, for that. Now, until 1907, believe it or not, the United States was considered by the Vatican to be missionary territory, even though that millions of Catholics, but to train priests for missionary territories, Rome had its own seminary in Rome, the Collegium Urbanicum. So Williams enrolled there in that to study, to become a priest for a missionary land, which the United States still was. He enrolled there in 1855. His classmates included the future Archbishop of New York, Michael Corrigan, studying there, because even though New York had millions of Catholics, but still the United States, Rome considered the United States mission territory. So guys studying for the priesthood for mission territory had to go to the missionary seminary, because that's, By August of 1862, Williams withdrew from priestly formation, making him the first openly African-American Catholic seminarian, but not the first publicly acknowledged African-American priest. because Williams did not go all the way to ordination. Now, Williams never did marry, so why did he leave? So celibacy was not the reason for his decision to leave. It was, now this is an inference, but it was likely a combination of internal tension at the seminary caused by the Civil War, which had begun 1 year earlier, as well as repeated warnings from his teachers that he could only minister as a priest in a place like Haiti, Liberia, Algeria, in other words, anywhere except the United States. But he left anyway. He returned to Maryland, fluent in Latin, French, and Italian, as well as English. He spent the rest of his life as an active Catholic layman, supported himself as a teacher in 2 of the schools that the Oblate sisters established for African Americans, and supplemented his income with a newspaper he established, the Clear Communicator. He practiced the faith in St. Francis Xavier Church in Baltimore, established by that community that originally met in the basement of the Oblate sisters' first building. So when that community, when it was created as a parish, as opposed to just a group of people meeting in the sisters' chapel, it was the first exclusively African-American parish in the United States. Later in life, Williams worked as a librarian at the Catholic University of America in Washington, D.C., until he relocated to Manhattan, New York in 1899. Where his old classmate from the Urbanicum had become Archbishop, was Archbishop Corrigan. While in Manhattan, Williams served as a sacristan at St. Benedict the Moor Parish, where he stayed until his death, and his funeral was held at the St. Benedict the Moor in 1901. Okay, so that's the other. So we have, in the same state in Maryland, we have Catholic religious institutes owning slaves. Yet we also have the first ministry to African American Catholics, all in the same. So that and all that contradiction flows throughout American history, not just with the Catholic Church, but that that's our primary interest here. Okay, so rewinding, 2 years after Williams left the seminary, so rewinding to 1860, the Jesuits began providing chaplains to the Oblate Sisters of Providence. And then the sisters expanded to Philadelphia and to New Orleans. In 1871, the Josephites began providing chaplains to the sisters. And eventually the sisters opened schools in 18 states. Now, much of that was, obviously after the Civil War, but still, it's quite the achievement considering their beginnings. So these initiatives for the service of African American Catholics remain guided by individuals on a local level, not at the level of policy of the Catholic hierarchy in the United States, until after the Civil War. So that was so that was one continuity triggered, that we followed from the Compromise of 1850. So now we rewind to the Compromise of 1850 to see another continuity. This one, this one connected to things that went before, because we saw anti-Catholicism present from the beginning of the country, and so it's continuing that. But there was a degree of escalation because of the California Compromise of 1850. So this brings us to introduce the Know-Nothings. The Compromise of 1850 was so repugnant to so many on both sides of the slavery issue that a consensus emerged in the ether, so to speak, just in the general conversation, that national political leadership had become useless, essentially, that it was unresponsive, it was self-serving, it was corrupt. So this facilitated, and this wasn't the first time that sentiment emerged, and it wasn't the last. Whenever that happens, that fosters the development of third parties. In 1850, a man named Charles Allen, Allen, of New York, along with 36 companions, formed what they originally called the Order of the Star-Spangled Banner. Into it, only white, American-born Protestants were allowed. This organization was the nucleus of the Know Nothing movement. The pervasive alienation from the established party system enabled an otherwise anomalous alliance to form under the aegis of this movement. For example, the movement originally included those from the context of the Unitarian Transcendentalist social activist movements that we saw previously, such as the abolitionist, well, obviously the abolitionist, but also the public school advocates, prison reformers, labor rights advocates. So that those people working together, there's no surprise, because often the same people were involved in multiple organizations like that. But in this case, with the Know Nothings, for a time, temporarily, they formed alliance with the rabid anti-Catholics, the racist xenophobes, that were generally referred to as nativists in the history writing of this period. How could they come together, all these kinds of people? Their point of unity was opposition to slavery. The social activist opposed it obviously on moral grounds. And it didn't really care what the Bible said about it. It's just, okay, slavery's wrong. That this didn't care what the Bible said. Whereas the nativist, who were not humanitarian at all and didn't have any, kind of moral center, they opposed slavery because they believed it represented unfair competition for the working classes. And that as long as slavery existed, it would prevent the working men to demand better wages and better working conditions. Now, the term "know nothing" that's not just me. I mean, I'm making that is what that term was first used in November of 1853 by Horace Greeley in the pages of his newspaper, the New York Tribune. And it was really it was mockery, that because he pointed out that members at that early period valued secrecy so highly that they would feign ignorance about it, like they wouldn't even admit that it existed. So if ever questioned about it, they would typically say, "I don't know nothing." So then Horace Greeley, in the pages of his newspaper, called them the Know Nothings. All right. So the Know Nothings, when individuals, when they would become public, it would not be as Know Nothings. So they created the Order of the Star-Spangled Banner, became a political party that they called the American Party. And under the American Party, they ran candidates, and they were quite successful, as we'll see. So here is the Know Nothing Party platform. Let's see, it goes on and on, so I won't read the whole thing. But here's, first, repeal of all naturalization laws. Naturalization was one way to become a citizen. That if you came in legally, you stay here a certain length of time, then you just naturally become a citizen. Naturalization. So the Know Nothings wanted to repeal that. Second, that no one but Americans, those born in America, could run for public office. Any public office. Third, they wanted what they called a pure common school system. That means public schools. Yeah, they wanted public schools. 4, war to the hilt. This is their platform. That's how they say, war to the hilt on political Romanism, which means the Catholic Church. 5th, opposition to the formation of militia companies that included foreigners, those of foreign birth. Let's see, I'll skip that. 9, number 9 on the platform, is stringent and effective immigration laws. I shouldn't, but it's just so typical with that. 12 on the platform is evicting or expelling from the country, deporting from the country, all those of foreign birth who were paupers. 14, eternal enmity against all those who attempt to carry out the principles of a foreign church or foreign state. So that's the Catholic Church. All right, so that goes on like that. So for a time, therefore, the anti-Catholic and anti-immigration nativist know-nothings allied with the idealistic humanitarian abolitionist. So we see what the nativists, this was their platform. On the other side, the idealist, we have an example from William Lloyd Garrison. Born in Massachusetts, famous abolitionist, humanitarian activist. He's best known for he created a newspaper to promote this cause called The Liberator, founded in 1831, published in Boston. So here is an excerpt of a document titled Declaration of Sentiments of the American Anti-Slavery Convention, which met in Philadelphia. And this was written by Garrison. So here's a couple of excerpts to juxtapose, so we saw what the know-nothing side, and now we see this side, but their point of unity shows how the 1850s were against slavery. Quote, more than 57 years have elapsed since the band of patriots convened in this place, meaning Philadelphia, to devise measures for the deliverance of this country from a foreign yoke, meaning England. The cornerstone upon which they founded the Temple of Freedom was broadly this: that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. We have met together for the achievement of an enterprise without which that of our fathers is incomplete, and which, for its magnitude, its solemnity, and its probable results upon the destiny of the world, as far transcends theirs as moral truth transcends physical force. In purity of motive, in earnestness of zeal, in decision of purpose, in intrepidity of action, in steadfastness of faith, in sincerity of spirit, we would not be inferior to them. Their principles led them to wage war against their oppressors and to spill human blood like water in order to be free. Our principles forbid the doing of evil, that good may come, and therefore lead us to reject and to entreat the oppressed to reject the use of all carnal weapons for the deliverance from bondage, relying solely upon those which are spiritual and mighty through God to the pulling down of strongholds. Hence we maintain that in view of the civil and religious privileges of this nation, the guilt of its oppression is unequaled by any other on the face of the earth, and therefore that it is bound to repent instantly and undo the heavy burdens and to let the oppressed go free. We further maintain that no man has a right to enslave or to imbrute his brother, to hold or acknowledge him for one moment as a piece of merchandise, to keep back his hire by fraud, or to brutalize his mind by denying him the means of intellectual, social, and moral improvement. The right to enjoy liberty is inalienable. To invade it is to usurp the prerogative of Jehovah. Every man has a right to his own body, to the products of his own labor, to the protection of the law, and to the common advantages of society. It is piracy to buy or steal a native African and subject him to servitude. Surely the sin is as great to enslave an American as an African. That the slaves ought instantly to be set free and brought under the protection of law. That all those laws which are now in force, admitting the right of slavery, are therefore before God utterly null and void, being an audacious usurpation of the divine prerogative, a daring infringement on the law of nature, a base overthrow of the very foundations of the social compact, a complete extinction of all the relations, endearments, and obligations of mankind, and a presumptuous transgression of all the holy commandments, and that therefore they ought instantly to be abrogated. We maintain that no compensation should be given to the planters emancipating their slaves, because it would be a surrender of the great fundamental principle that man cannot hold property in man, because slavery is a crime and therefore is not an article to be sold, because the holders of slaves are not the just proprietors of what they claim. Freeing the slave is not depriving them of property, but restoring it to its rightful owner. It is not wronging the master, but righting the slave, restoring him to himself. We regard as delusive, cruel, and dangerous any scheme of expatriation which pretends to aid, either directly or indirectly, in the emancipation of the slaves, or to be a substitute for the immediate and total abolition of slavery. Okay, it goes on. It's a very long document, but you see the point. You can also see that kind of high idealism juxtaposed with the know-nothing platform. And then in the long run, that alliance could never last, but for a time it did. Catholic opinion on slavery in the 1850s remained divided, generally by regional affiliation, but with some exceptions. Francis Kenrick, whom we've met several times before, Bishop of Philadelphia until 1851 when he became Archbishop of Baltimore, he regretted the realities of slavery, but he believed that obedience to the law was more important, as serving the higher good of avoiding chaos. In New York, Dagger John, who we've also met, Bishop John Hughes, had relatives. His sister had married a family, that the Rodrigue family, that lived on lived in the French colony of Saint-Domingue, which became Haiti. And they barely escaped with their lives when the Haitian slave uprising occurred. So, hearing their stories, he feared the same result would occur if Garrison got his way, and slavery would just eliminate it immediately. Moreover, Hughes rationalized that, as many others did, that slavery, despite its obvious harm that happens to the slave, that it did bring Christianity to many who otherwise would have remained pagan. Among early Catholic lay leaders, a slave owner was Charles Carroll of Carrollton, whom we also met earlier. He was the only Catholic to sign the Declaration of Independence. In 1797, he introduced a bill before the Maryland State Senate for gradual abolition of slavery. Now, it would have only been in Maryland, but still, it was. Of course, it was defeated. But he was a slave owner, very wealthy, man. But he was pushing, because he also inspired by the Declaration of Independence, but also having the same fears that Bishop Kenrick later had, that if you immediately free them all, well, then there'll be chaos. So I thought, okay, gradual elimination, would be the way. But it was defeated. Another prominent Catholic layman who looms large in American history was Roger Brook Teenie. And we met him in the 1830s when we covered Andrew Jackson. Teenie became the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, the first Catholic Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. And later, in this decade, which we're covering, the 1850s, he presided over the Dred Scott decision, which we'll cover in due course. Teenie grew up in a Maryland slave-owning family. But over 30 years before he wrote the Dred Scott decision, on his own, he chose to free his own slaves, except for two, who he said were too old. And, he said he supported them as long as they lived. But he did not. That was a personal choice, and that's how he thought abolition should happen. That moral suasion over time would lead slave owners to just emancipate their slaves. So he did not support the abolition movement, certainly not in the absolute form that Garrison articulated. He thought that a complete and sudden emancipation of all slaves would bring ruin to the country. The Archbishop of Cincinnati, Ohio, John Purcell, was one of the few who issued a call for emancipation of slaves for moral reasons. The Archbishop's brother, who was a priest in the same in the same diocese, Cincinnati, his brother was editor of the Catholic Telegraph, Catholic newspaper. His brother was Father Edward Purcell. In his editorials, he argued the anti-slavery position for moral reasons, that the church proclaims, now his is based on the Galatians passages rather than the Ephesians, that, in Christ Jesus, that there is no Jew or Greek, no slave, no free, all are one in Christ Jesus. And therefore, we're all, equal before God. And so therefore, a baptized person cannot advocate slavery. Okay, the Fugitive Slave Act, which was the last element of the California Compromise, had other repercussions. So the Know Nothings and the Anti-Slavery Society, Garrison, those were not the only ones who opposed slavery. And those were not the only methods of opposing slavery. There were some who preferred, what the military calls direct action. And for that, we become acquainted with John Brown. John Brown lived from 1800 to 1859. Born in Connecticut. Father's name Owen, mother's name Ruth. John was the fourth of 8 children. When he was 5, the family relocated to Oberlin, Ohio, where Owen, John's father, was a supporter of Oberlin College. Oberlin College was one of the first colleges in the United States to admit African Americans, and is the first one still in existence to have admitted women. At age 16, John attended a preparatory school in Connecticut with the hope of becoming a Congregationalist minister. It's a Calvinist minister. On the 21st of June, 1820, John married Deanthe Lusk and relocated to Pennsylvania, where they set up the family. There they had 7 children. John supported the family by raising cattle and supplemented his income with work as a surveyor and a tanner. Deanthe died in 1832, after which John married Mary Ann Day on June 14, 1833. With her, he relocated to Kent, Ohio, where they had 13 children. And John opened a tannery. In 1837, after the murder of a well-known abolitionist and editorialist named Elijah Lovejoy, Brown proclaimed or announced he started becoming active in the anti-slavery cause. He moved his family in 1846 to Springfield, Massachusetts, where an abolitionist movement was already underway. The Anti-Slavery Society, Garrison Society, had been established there in Massachusetts. He, as a parishioner, or attending services at Free Church, as it was called, Free Church, he heard lectures, speeches, memorials by two famous African-American abolitionists, former slaves, a man and a woman, Frederick Douglass and Sojourner Truth. Sojourner Truth was a woman. Her actual name, she was a slave in New York. Her name was Isabella Baumfree. But then later in life, she took that name, Sojourner Truth, to express her mission, And Frederick Douglass, we're gonna meet again. So this catches up Brown to the California Compromise, including the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. In response, Brown established a vigilante group to assist runaway slaves or to forcibly protect them from being recaptured. So this would be part of the Underground Railroad. I mean, it wasn't all underground. I mean, they called it was part along the way. The escaped slaves would be hidden in basements and under barns. So they did spend some time underground, but it was that. But there were bounty hunters. I mean, there were slave catchers, and they made their living. If they brought back a slave, they got a bounty on that. So, but Brown's vigilante group that after 1850 he became violent. Relocated the family to North Elba, New York. His oldest sons were ready to set up life on their own, so some of them moved to the Kansas Territory. Brown himself went to Kansas in 1855, and his vigilante group became involved on the anti-slavery side in the series of conflicts that became known and are still referred to in American history books as Bleeding Kansas. One of the northern cities that John Brown visited to raise funds and to garner journalistic support was Philadelphia. 2 years after the Fugitive Slave Act passed, Philadelphia received a new bishop, who later became a saint. Contextualizing that development requires us to become acquainted with the Redemptorist order in the United States, which in our country gave us one saint so far and one blessed. So the saint is Bishop St. John Neumann, and the blessed is Blessed Francis Selos. So the Redemptorist. Let's see how long we've been. Yeah, I'll continue. Officially, the Congregation of the Most Holy Redeemer was established on November 9th, 1732, by St. Alphonsus Liguori, Ligouri, established at Scala near Amalfi, Italy. 17 years later, in 1749, Pope Benedict XIV granted papal recognition to the order. Today they serve in over 100 countries. The Redemptorists were, and remain, a missionary society directed to reviving parish life. Their rule, demands that they, quote, strive to imitate the virtues and examples of Jesus Christ, our Redeemer, consecrating themselves especially to the preaching of the Word of God to the poor. They take simple vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, which members of all religious orders take. For the Redemptorists, the vow of poverty bound them to refuse all ecclesiastical dignities outside of the congregation. However, as we shall see in American history, the Holy See, owing to the needs of the expanding church for bishops, at times dispensed this requirement, which is how the Redemptorist father, John Neumann, became Bishop John Neumann of Philadelphia. To those vows already listed, the Redemptorists added another vow, an oath of perseverance, to live in the congregation until death, rather than exclaustrate to become either a diocesan priest or to join another order. Their methodology consisted of parish missions and parish retreats, and at times included their assuming ordinary care of parishes, in which case they historically promoted parochial schools, parish schools. One young man, inspired by the Redemptorist charism, is now beatified, and hopefully one day he'll become a saint. One who served here in New Orleans and actually died at his post here in New Orleans. Blessed Francis Xavier Seelos, Seelos. He came to know the Redemptorists in his home country of Bavaria, Germany, southern Germany. To configure him culturally and historically, and to understand what he brought, and he is an exemplar of literally millions of other German Catholics who came to the United States over the many in the 19th century, but into the 20th. So to configure him, we travel to the Alpine mountains of Europe and find Lake Formarinsee in present-day Vorarlberg, Austria. There, gravity drains water from this lake through a karst fenster, forming a 150-mile-long river, the River Lech, which is a right tributary of the more famous river, Danube. At the point where it egresses the Alps, at an elevation of 2,500 feet, it spills down onto a plain. There, the ancient Romans, the empire, established a base in the gorge of the river. They terraformed a connection to the Via Claudia, which stretched north to Vendelicum, which on today's maps is Augsburg, Germany. So that was the Via Claudia went north that way and then south to Italy, where it intersected the River Po. And that was the imperial province of Raetia on the imperial maps. That's Raetia. And it was the base of Legio III Italica, guarding the Alpine frontier, the Third Legion. In the 5th century AD, when the empire collapsed, a Germanic tribe called the Bajuvari occupied the area. Evidently, some old imperials remained, as the Roman name for the gorge was retained in the new language as Fusen, and the Bajuvari endured as the Bavarians, creating a distinct culture that still characterizes southern Germany. Blessed Seelos was one of them, born in Fusen on the 11th of January, 1819. He was one of 12 children. He was named in honor of the Jesuit missionary, St. Francis Xavier. His father Magnus was a tailor and a volunteer sacristan at the parish church, the Church of St. Mang. Seelos was baptized there on the day of his birth. His mother, Franziska Schwarzenbach, was also a devout Catholic. At the time of Seelos' birth, in 1819, Germany was not politically united. That took place in 1871, after Seelos died. So Seelos was born a citizen not of the German nation, but of the constituent Kingdom of Bavaria in southern Germany. At the time, it was ruled by the House Wittelsbach, Wittelsbach. So if, tourist sites in Bavaria, like Neuschwanstein, the palace that was built by the Wittelsbachs. From 1820 until the First World War, many indigenous Germans left to the United States. They are calculated, and this is based on the census. Of course, some may have gotten in and not counted. 7,237,594 came from Germany to the United States in less than a century, between 1820 and 1914. Seeking opportunities, not available in the many small and often tyrannical principalities of Europe. So these 7.2 million who came over here grew through family formation to a German-American population of 47.9 million. in the 20th century. And many of those Germans who came were of the Catholic faith. The waves of flight from Europe overwhelmed the personnel and the resources of the bishops in 19th century United States, leading to developments that shaped the life of the two Redemptorists we're covering, Silos, and shortly we'll meet Neumann. Meanwhile, infant mortality was high everywhere in the early 19th century. 3 of Silos' siblings died, and Silos himself was ill and often bedridden for his first decade of life. His mother comforted him by reading Lives of the Saints, and noted that even in childhood, he endured sickness and hardships very patiently, which is not common among kids. They want to go out and play. Silos' sister Antonia wrote that he was always so amiable and tranquil that we loved him most of all. On the 3rd of January, 1825, when he was well enough, Silos was enrolled in the local Volksschule, the primary school, the elementary school. It was pretty basic. It was a one-room schoolhouse, and the students, they nicknamed it the Corn House, because it was a barn. I mean, it was a barn that had sacks of corn in it. Along with standard elementary studies, he studied religion, reading, writing, arithmetic. Was also the South German context. That were also taught hymns, folk songs. He was noted. He was an enthusiastic singer, and he learned to play the violin. Silos received the sacrament of confirmation on September 3rd, 1828, 4 months before his 10th birthday, from the Bishop of Augsburg, the Most Reverend Augustine Ignatius Albrecht von Rieg. Owing to the sequence in which the sacraments were offered at the time, which is not the way it's done now, but at the time it was, he received First Communion 2 years later, after his confirmation, on April 2nd, 1830. His sister Antonia recalled that afterwards he started to play priest with his friends, around an improvised altar. And he volunteered to be an altar boy at St. Mang Parish. Silos completed the Volksschule, the elementary school, in 1831, 3 months after his 12th birthday. He had highest grades in religion, reading, and conduct. Meanwhile, during these formative years for Silos, events were proceeding on both sides of the Atlantic, Europe and the United States, that opened the path for his adult ecclesiastical life. In 1828, 9 years after Silos' birth, Monsignor Frederick Rese, R-E-S-E, and that year he was the Vicar General of the Diocese of Cincinnati, Ohio. Later he became the founding Bishop of Detroit. I think we met him earlier in the course. In 1828 he visited Europe in search of recruits. While in Vienna, Austria, he recruited 3 Redemptorist priests and 3 lay brothers. Through them, the Redemptorist order entered the United States. They arrived within its borders. They debarked in New York on June 20th, 1832. And following Rese, they initiated their apostolate in Michigan. In the same year that the Redemptorists moved to America, in October of 1832, Silos moved away from his home for the first time to attend gymnasium, which is, essentially their high school. This one was the Institute of St. Stephen. For 7 years, he studied classics during the period of his life that corresponds to high school and junior college. And this gymnasium was maintained by the Benedictines. Sister Antonia said that Silos was very popular. He was an enthusiastic musician, and he was the one who always reached out to the lonely or misfit students. On April 8th, 1839, the final year of Silos' classical studies, the American Redemptorist Superior, Father Joseph Prost, P-R-O-S-T, opened St. Philomena Church in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, to serve German immigrants. This later turned out to be Selos's first assignment as a priest. At the time, the city of Pittsburgh was within the ecclesial boundaries of the Diocese of Philadelphia. So Father Prost received permission for this from the Most Reverend Henry Conwell, Bishop of Philadelphia. The following month, May 26, 1839, Pope Gregory XVI canonized Alphonsus Liguori as a saint. So that gave added publicity and notoriety to the Redemptorist order he founded and to its mission. 3 months later, on August 26, 1839, Selos graduated from the St. Stephen Institute, ranked 9th out of a class of 69. And that sufficed, top 10, he was within the top 10 in other words, so that sufficed for him to get a recommendation to attend university. On the 5th of November, 1839, he commenced his studies at the University of Munich, about 50 miles east of Augsburg, to study philosophy. While a university student, he made a pilgrimage 58 miles east to the Gnadenkapelle, the Chapel of Grace at Altötting, which was the site of a miraculous healing in 1489 attributed to Our Lady. Pope John Paul II made a pilgrimage to that same shrine in 1980, and Pope Benedict XVI made a pilgrimage there in 2006. During his first year of study, Selos's first year, on July 26, 1840, Redemptorists assumed care for the German-speaking Catholics of Baltimore, St. John the Evangelist and St. James the Less parishes. That is where Selos would be ordained a priest and would offer his first Mass. The Redemptorist success in parish work fostered their rapid expansion in the United States. After Baltimore, they went to Rochester, New York, then New York, the city of New York, then Philadelphia, then Buffalo in the state of New York in the north, Detroit, and New Orleans. Selos would spend time at many of these foundations as a priest, and the last being New Orleans, which is where he died. Meanwhile, Selos entered Major Seminary on September 5, 1842, 75 miles northwest of Munich at Dillingen, which is in Swabia, Germany. But during his first year of theology, he applied for admission to the Redemptorist American Mission. Selos was accepted as a novice in the Redemptorist order on November 22, 1842, by Father Alexander Zvitkovich. Coincidentally, this was the feast of St. Cecilia, patroness of musicians, and Selos was a musician. He sailed for America from Le Havre, France, on March 17, 1848, aboard the St. Nicholas. The ship was named St. Nicholas. Arrived in New York 5 weeks later, April 20th, 1843, which happened to be Easter Thursday that year. Selos began his novitiate in the aforementioned St. James Church in Baltimore on May 16, 1843. 1 year later, to the day, 1844, May 16th, Selos professed the vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience as a Redemptorist. 7 months later, he was ordained a priest on December 22, 1844, in the Redemptorist Church of St. James in Baltimore. He was ordained by the Archbishop of Baltimore, Archbishop Samuel Eccleston. Selos offered his first Mass on Christmas Day in the same church. On January 12th, 1845, Selos performed his first, he was assigned to St. Philomena in Pittsburgh. And then he performed his first baptism, heard his first confessions. Initially, he was ministering in German and French, and then had to learn English. So his first priestly assignment was St. Philomena in Pittsburgh. He was what today would be called a parochial vicar. His first pastor and superior of the house was another immigrant Redemptorist priest, canonized in 1977 as St. John Neumann, later Bishop of Philadelphia, So far, the only male U.S. citizen canonized a saint. Selos wrote about Neumann later in these words: "He loved me as his own son. Above all, the example of his virtuous life is always before my eyes. His constant modesty, his great humility, and his all-conquering long-suffering." So, Saint John Nepomucene Neumann. All right, so John you can spell. Now the middle name, Nepomucene. And the surname Neumann, Neumann. So let me just say, please don't be offended by me saying this, but just to clarify, this is not the same person as St. John Henry Newman. That is an English saint. And the surname is spelled Newman, Newman. This is a completely different guy. St. John Neumann. Okay. St. John Neumann was born in the year 1811 on March 28th in Bohemia, which then was part of the Austrian Empire. Now it's the Czech Republic. His father, Johann Philipp Neumann, was a stocking knitter, and his mother, Agnes, assisted him in the family business. Early on, discerning a vocation to ecclesiastical life, John entered seminary in 1831. Then, in 1833, enrolled in the Charles University in Prague, which is now the Czech Republic. By the time he was done, Neumann was conversant in 6 languages and had a working knowledge of botany. In 1835, he was ready for ordination. But the Archbishop of Prague, Archbishop Ankwitz, had more priests than he had parishes. So he told Neumann to wait a few years. Imagine that. So he waited, and then the next year he applied again. The bishop told him the same thing. So after that refusal, Neumann asked for and obtained permission to go to the United States. Arrived in New York in 1836 with 1 bag, 1 suit, which he was wearing, and $1. And a letter of recommendation from Archbishop Ankwitz, which Neumann used to obtain an interview with the Bishop of New York, a guy we've encountered several times, a French immigrant priest, Bishop Jean Dubois. Dubois accepted him and ordained Neumann for the Diocese of New York on June 25, 1836. He was ordained in the Old St. Patrick's Cathedral in New York City. At the time, the Diocese of New York encompassed all of New York State and half of New Jersey. Neumann was assigned near the Canadian border, riding the horseback circuit in the Niagara Falls region and from Lake Ontario to the border of Pennsylvania. That area was home to about 200,000 Catholics. After 4 years of this horseback ministry, Neumann requested and received from Bishop Dubois permission to join the Redemptorist in 1840. Even though he was a priest, he still had to do novitiate, formation in the order. So after that, he professed vows in Baltimore on January 16, 1842. In keeping with the ministry of his order, Neumann continued traveling, but he did not feel as isolated, because wherever there was a network of Redemptorist parishes, so wherever he went, there was a community he could stay with. Pennsylvania, Maryland, Ohio. In Pittsburgh, Neumann's story intersects with that of Selos, as Neumann was superior of the community and pastor of St. Philomena Church, Selos' first assignment as a priest. Selos arrived already fluent in German and French, worked hard to learn English in order to interact with the Irish immigrants. He had to prepare classes to teach religion. He prepared homilies for masses, familiarized himself with the German and Irish immigrant working-class families of the parish, and applied himself to general ecclesial ministry. With St. John Neumann as his mentor, Selos completed his first assignment, fluent in English, and a sought-after confessor and spiritual director for German, English, and French-speaking Catholics. 1846. Neumann introduced Seelos to mission preaching, assigned him as part of a Redemptorist group visiting St. Vincent's Church in Youngstown, Pennsylvania. He did well. The following year, September of 1847, Seelos was appointed novice master at the St. Philomena community while remaining assigned to the parish, even though he was only 28 years old. So you see, seminarians is the branches of the tree of pain. This is how they grow. So, mission preaching, work in the parish, plus novice master. So that they just add. That's how the tree of pain grows. 3 years later, 1849, Neumann, the future saint John Neumann, was transferred from Pennsylvania to Maryland, became pastor of St. Augustine Church in Elk Ridge, Maryland. The next year, 1850, the Redemptorists created an American province. The first provincial was the Reverend Bernard Hafkenscheid, Hafkenscheid. He was a fellow student of the guy who later became Pope Leo XIII. His priority, Hafkenscheid's priority, was establishing a seminary and a location for the novitiate, so that he would not have to send all his guys back to Europe for training. So he chose as the location Cumberland, Maryland, and Baltimore for the novitiate. 1 year later, the success of their missions to individual German parishes prompted the Redemptorists to send 12 experienced preachers from Europe to initiate the order's first multi-state parish mission circuit. It commenced on April 1st, 1851, at St. Joseph's Church in New York, in the course of which they heard 6,000 confessions and gave communion to 60 adults and 400 children. At this period, parish missions were well advertised in advance. They were scheduled to last for at least 1 week, but sometimes up to a month. The Redemptorists generally assigned a team for these missions, with one identified as superior. Their internal constitutions required that each mission consist of, first, the Redemptorist hearing confessions; second, that they give sermons on prayer; third, that they give at least a sermon praying for the intercession of the Blessed Mother; that they give another talk on devotion to the Holy Family. Apart from that, once those 4 conditions were met, the missions were adaptable to the particular circumstances of the parish. Was it urban or rural, in a factory area, or whatever, or was it on a river? A railroad. So it could be adapted. In the same year, 1851, Seelos was appointed pastor of St. Philomena Parish and rector of its Redemptorist community. So you see, at the age of 32. Some in the order resented his youth, as he was younger than some of the clergy placed now under his authority. But Seelos continued to be beloved by the faithful for his simplicity, his kindness, and his approachability. The following year, Seelos became a U.S. citizen, a naturalized citizen, 1852, and Neumann had become a citizen 4 years earlier in 1848. But in the same year that Seelos became a citizen, 1852, the Holy See appointed Seelos' first pastor, Father John Neumann, as the 4th Bishop of Philadelphia on February 5th of that year. His predecessor as Bishop of Philadelphia was Francis Kendrick, whom we've encountered several times. Kendrick was transferred to be Archbishop of Baltimore. So Kendrick presided over Neumann's ordination as a bishop and his consecration specifically its installation as the Bishop of Philadelphia on March 28th in St. Alphonsus Church, the Redemptorist base in Baltimore. During Neumann's administration in Philadelphia, new parish churches were completed at the rate of nearly 1 per month. He created a Catholic bank. He was the first bishop in the country to organize a diocesan system of parish-based schools. He was not the first one to open parish schools, but to organize it as a system on the diocesan level. He did this because the Catholic parents were fearful of Protestant influence and discrimination in the public schools, for reasons we already covered extensively. Under his administration, the number of parochial schools in his diocese increased from 1 to 200 in only 8 years. He died young. For insights into Neumann's teaching methodology, why this was so successful, we do have a priceless historical resource that just accidentally got preserved. On October 1st, 1834, beginning the last year of his scholasticate at the seminary in Prague, Neumann began keeping a journal, a diary, which he titled Mon Journal. He wrote it in French as a means of practicing that language. Beginning on March 22nd of the next year, 1835, he started writing entries in German as well as French, and then later added English, so he was teaching himself all these languages. In the Mon Journal, he tells us, we get like a snapshot of his development at that point in his life. And at his first concern, early in the journal, one of the first things he wrote about was that he wanted to get a copy of the Catechism of the Council of Trent in the original Latin. One of his classmates and friends, Anton Lod, later mentioned that Neumann's also his close study of the writings of St. Robert Bellarmine. One of his Catechism of the Council of Trent, and was comparing, like when he came to a section, say with a catechism on baptism, then he would look at St. Robert Bellarmine's writings, and then later St. Peter Canisius's writings, to see how were their long writings then summarized, in a concise catechism statement. Again, teaching himself. Books from Neumann's own library that he brought with him to the United States, and then as he built up in the United States, he bequeathed, and when he died, he bequeathed that to the Diocese of Philadelphia. So they are in Philadelphia, in the Neumann Museum at St. Peter's Church in Philadelphia, which is where he was buried. Anyway, there one may find a copy of a catechism, his catechism. He found one, a copy that was printed in Prague, and it numbers. It has in Roman numerals. It has 8 prefatory pages plus 180, numbered pages. Very small print, and it contains a preface. That edition of the Catechism contains a preface in the form of a pastoral letter from the Archbishop of Prague to the clergy of Prague, in which he spoke about the Society of Christian Doctrine and the need for sound doctrine, and that he was obtaining these copies of this catechism so that the priests could do that in the diocese they could form a society and all share the same mission. So like in every parish, they would all be teaching the same thing, which was not possible because of the catechism. So all this influenced Neumann, this idea of a diocesan system. Also in this book, Neumann hand wrote. He was one of those that sometimes wrote hand notes into his books. And the inscription reveals that he acquired this particular book in 1835, his final year in seminary. Along with this, a manuscript has survived of a handwritten German translation made by Neumann from some of the writings of Robert Bellarmine, which were in Latin, of course. So Neumann translated those from Latin to German and wrote them out by hand. And he made additional notes that provide us, this insight into his personal formation. One example that he wrote as a nervous, worried, overly conscientious young student, his class was given an assignment on January 7th, 1835, to prepare a presentation, and his date of giving the presentation was March 8th. His was on how St. Peter Canisius made use of Scripture in his catechetical writings and sermons. So correlating this note in that copy of his catechism with entries in his journal, which he dated, reveals, he was a very earnest young student. He was anxious to do the assignment well. He was fascinated with the material, but he was painfully nervous about speaking in front of his classmates. He repeatedly revised his notes. He stayed up the day of his presentation until 3:30 a.m. the morning of his speech. Now, he didn't record his grade, but he did record a note of thanks to God that he managed to finish it despite his stomach-churning nervousness and embarrassing, sopping wet perspiration. So thusly saints are made. As Bishop of Philadelphia, Neumann constantly pressed for more parochial schools. See, that early on, that concern for education. He also established Santa Maria Magdalena de Pazzi Church, which was the first parish for Italian-speaking Catholics. As the waves of immigration were coming. He, in 1853, he introduced the 40 hours devotion, which is a Eucharistic devotion, beginning at St. Philip Neri Church. And he was assiduous in visiting the parishes of the diocese. In 1857, owing to failing health, he was sent a coadjutor, James Wood. Okay. No, that's good. In 1854, Neumann traveled to Rome and was present in St. Peter's Basilica on December 8th, along with 53 cardinals and 139 other bishops, along with thousands of others, when Pope Pius IX declared or defined ex cathedra the dogma of the Immaculate Conception of Mary. Then returned to the United States. 6 years later, while doing errands, just walking on the street, on Thursday, January 5th, 1860, Neumann dropped dead. Collapsed on a Philadelphia street. Died of a massive heart attack at the age of 48. Neumann was declared venerable by Pope Benedict XV in 1921. He was beatified by Pope Paul VI during the Second Vatican Council in 1953. And he was canonized by the same Pope, Paul VI, on June 19, 1977. Meanwhile, in 1853, the year after Neumann became bishop, the Redemptorist novitiate transferred from Baltimore to Annapolis, Maryland, because the heirs of Charles Carroll of Carrollton, he of course was deceased, but his heirs donated one of his estates to the Redemptorist Fathers. The following year, January 30th, 1854, Seelos was transferred from Pennsylvania to Maryland to be pastor of St. Alphonsus Church in Baltimore and rector of its Redemptorist community. St. Alphonsus was quite the sprawling operation at the time. It included 2 parish centers for 2 different language groups, another 2 smaller parishes on the outskirts of Baltimore, and 4 mission stations in the rural area. In addition, it had 1,300 children enrolled in its schools, plus 500 black Catholics whom we met earlier when introduced to Mother Elizabeth Lang, the foundress of the Oblate Sisters of Providence. Seelos embraced the act of apostolate, as had his spiritual father, Neumann, though after 3 years it wore down Seelos's health. On March 7th, 1857, coming out of the confessional in the evening, as he stretched his arms and legs, blood began spewing from his mouth from a hemorrhage. He was hospitalized for 4 weeks. He was 38 years old. After his release from the hospital, Seelos was transferred to become pastor of St. Mary's Parish in Annapolis, Maryland, April 12, 1857. Curiously, this appointment lasted only 1 month. On May 19th, 1857, he was transferred again, this time to Cumberland, Maryland, to become superior and prefect of students at the Redemptorist Seminary. He was replacing Father Michael Mueller, whose abrasive disposition was considered responsible for driving away many vocations. Seelos did very well in his new duties, but Father Mueller became his personal enemy, even though Seelos had not in any way sought this new position. So, seminarians, I'll interject here. The sexual sins of the clergy are the ones that get all the publicity, because this disgusting society in which we live is completely obsessed with sex. But you will learn the most pervasive sins of the clergy are ambition and, frankly, alcoholism. Those are the two most common. In this case, it was ambition. It's poison. It's absolute poison. It's just like opening, taking the cap off of a gas tank of a car, sticking a straw down, and just start drinking. It's poison. Anyway, 3 years later, 1860, the Most Reverend Michael O'Connor, Bishop of Pittsburgh, abdicated his position to become a Jesuit. He recommended Seelos as the person most qualified to succeed. And Seelos was informed of this, and he wrote to Pope Pius IX explaining his inadequacy to accept this responsibility. He begged, quote, to be liberated from this calamity. And he was overjoyed when another priest was, became bishop instead. So instead of that, Seelos was assigned, he's at Cumberland, Maryland. And he was there when his country of adoption tore itself apart in the Civil War, 1861 to 65. And we'll go into detail on that when we get to the next decade. But just to finish Seelos' life, so you have this whole Redemptorist unit together. In the same year, 1862, the Civil War was 1861 to 65. During that conflict, Mother Henriette DeLille, whom we've already met, she died in New Orleans on November 16th, 1862. Same year, 1862, the Redemptorists moved their seminary and novitiate from Cumberland, Maryland to Annapolis, Maryland, and assigned Seelos back there as pastor of St. Mary's, as well as rector of the community house and prefect of the students. See the tree of pain. However, on August 30th the same year, Seelos was removed from the latter position, prefect of students, as a result of slander sent to the upper echelons of the order in Europe by Father Michael Mueller as revenge for the imagined offense of having not asked to replace him 5 years earlier. The calumny Mueller wrote was as follows, quote, "The only thing I have against Father Seelos is that he has not the judgment, the wisdom, and the reflection, the manner and the method to direct students in the spirit of the congregation." So because of that, Seelos got removed. So you see, seminarians, just keep that in. That's one of the ways the ambition, the people will never tell you what they really think. They'll say it behind your back, spread it around. So you may walk into a room where everybody knows all this is being said except you. So, but people. So revenge was had, but Seelos did remain pastor of St. Mary's and rector of the community. Following year, March 19th, 1863, the ghoulish carnage of the many battles of the Civil War prompted the Union President Abraham Lincoln to push through Congress a conscription law, drafting into the military males aged 20 to 45. Yet it contained a provision that service could be avoided by paying a fee. This manifest injustice to the poor led to the first draft riot in New York. As rector of the Redemptorist house closest to the Capitol, it fell to Seelos to travel to Washington and meet with Lincoln regarding drafting seminarians and priests into the congregation. And obviously the order didn't want these guys drafted in to be regular soldiers, because then they'd have to kill people. And priests aren't supposed to do that. To his own surprise, Silos obtained the exemption, even though Lincoln was not a Catholic and he had, no history of any, particular interest in Catholicism. Silos did not record the details of the meeting, but only wrote in a letter to his sister, quote, "And the storm passed over, thanks to God and the intercession of Mary." 6 months later, on September 22nd, 1863, Silos was appointed superior of a parish mission band. This was another national, well, at least multi-state. They traveled to 10 states over the next 2 years, and it proved to be a spectacular success. With so many families bereaved at the loss of loved ones in the fighting, or worried at those who were still enlisted, there were many desperately in need of spiritual solace, which they provided. He was able to preach in English and German in Connecticut, Illinois, Michigan, Missouri, New Jersey, New York, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Rhode Island, and Wisconsin. During this mission, coincidentally, the Civil War finally ended. The last Confederate army surrendered on May 26, 1865. It was General Kirby Smith, commanded in northern Louisiana and eastern Texas. Silos' 2-year mission ended in April of 1865, 1 month before the last Confederate army surrendered. 4 months later, in August of 65, Silos was assigned to St. Mary's Parish in Detroit, Michigan. This time he was only parochial vicar, not pastor or rector. His pastor there, Father Francis von Emstead, wrote of him, quote, "Father Silos did everything willingly and cheerfully, that at all times he showed such pious joy, and knew how to entertain everyone in his presence in a kindly way. His look was piety, his glance was comfort, his expression was love. Charity glistened in his eyes, and benevolence played around his venerable aspect." Following year, September 28, 1866, Silos was transferred to New Orleans, assigned to St. Mary of the Assumption Parish. He was granted an infused grace of knowledge to know the time and the manner of his death. He confided this to a sister of Notre Dame who was on the same train. They were both going to New Orleans. She asked him how long he was going to stay in the city. He replied, "For a year, and then I will die of yellow fever." And that's exactly what happened. Arriving at the parish, he commented, "Here I'll rest my bones in the grave, for I think I have wandered enough." Bishop Antoine Blanc, whom we've met several times before, is the one who invited the Redemptorists to New Orleans in 1843. As diverse populations continued to immigrate, settled near the river. New Orleans was a port, but still is, the river for work. 3 churches were constructed within what was locally known as the Redemptorist Parish. First was Notre Dame de Bon Secours, which was for the French. Second, St. Alphonsus was for the Irish, but in the English language. Third, St. Mary's Assumption for the Germans. The compound also had 3 convents for religious sisters, 2 orphanages, and 5 schools. And all this was within walking distance of each other. And 2 of those churches are still there. The first, Notre Dame de Bon Secours, is gone, but St. Alphonsus church building is there. It's not used anymore. But St. Mary's Assumption Church is still used. That's where Silos is buried, in the crypt there. Silos ministered in New Orleans for a year, at which point the mosquito enters our story. Yellow fever erupted. The first deaths recorded in the city in this particular outbreak occurred on September 3rd, 1867. Yellow fever is transmitted to humans through the bite of one species of mosquito, the species Aedes aegypti. The female of the species, so she bites through the skin for the purpose of sucking blood This is hematophagia, so, it eats blood. And from the blood, she extracts protein to grow her eggs. She can lay up to 200 eggs in pools of stagnant water. And even today, there's no cure for yellow fever, but there is a vaccine that was not available in this time period we're covering. By the time this outbreak was done, 3,107 died in New Orleans in 2 months. So it did not have the lethality of the more famous 1853 outbreak, which killed 8,000 in the city. But this one in 1867 did have a broader impact on the region. It killed 20,000 as far away as Texas. And one of its victims was the wife of Sam Houston. Houston as in Houston, Texas. Anyway, in the Redemptorist Parish in New Orleans, 11 priests and brothers contracted the disease, including Selos. 4 of them died, including Selos. With regard to Selos, Father Benedict, who was in the house, recorded that Selos became ill on September 17, 1867. Described it as follows, quote, "On the 17th of September, while the community was at table, it was noticed that Father Selos looked unusually depressed and pale. All perceived the clearest marks of yellow fever about the eyes. He appeared to recover for a time, but 9 days later was still severely weak, exhausted, and listless. Our dear dying father remained conscious to his last breath. His lips continually moved in prayer. His eyes were fixed on the crucifix until they could see no more. A supernatural brightness appeared to illuminate his dying countenance. His joy, as the moment of dissolution approached, communicated itself to all present." Selos died on October 4th, 1867, at the age of 48 years and 9 months. It was remembered by Brother Louis, another member of the house, that he asked the dying priest to tell him how to please God. And Selos responded, quote, "I think the best way is to accept the will of God, to obey faithfully and quietly the orders of one's superior, and to do the work assigned to you. It is not necessary to accomplish extraordinary deeds." Selos was beatified by Pope St. John Paul II on April 9th, the year 2000. The Pope stated, quote, "Today, Blessed Francis Xavier Selos invites the members of the Church to deepen their union with Christ in the sacraments of penance and the Eucharist. Through his intercession, may all who work in the vineyard for the salvation of God's people be encouraged and strengthened in their task." So the cause for canonization for Blessed Selos is still in process. Since he is beatified, according to the current rules, he needs one miracle attributed to him for someone who prayed to him as a beatus. And then, once verified, that would qualify him for canonization, which he could join his spiritual father, St. John Neumann. Okay. The year after Neumann became Bishop of Philadelphia, the first plenary council of all bishops in the United States met in Baltimore, the first plenary council of Baltimore, 1852. So we will pause here, and we will pick up with that next time. So for now, thank you for your attention. This session is adjourned.